Great. So I see the message from Tony that we should kick it off. So I'm going to start us off. Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Nick Staff, and I'm a CISO Executive Advisor with EVOTEK. Thank you for joining our panel on data privacy today, and thank you to our, should be three, but right now, two privacy experts, Matt Stamper and Natalie Prescott, for agreeing to come speak. To start us off, I'd like to give our guests a chance to introduce themselves. Matt, do you mind starting that for us?
Nick, thank you. And Natalie, it's great to be with you as well. Matt Stamper, I am the CEO of Executive Advisors Group. I've been focused in on the world of privacy and in the interrelationship with security dating back to my days when I was an analyst at Gartner. Love the topic, very much enjoy looking at how these two worlds intersect. So I'm very excited about the discussion today.
Thank you, Matt.
I was going to say, we're a small but mighty group. So Matt and I go way back. So I'm Natalie Prescott. I'm the General Counsel and Chief Privacy Officer of Fulgent Genetics. We're a publicly traded company in the laboratory diagnostics, healthcare, direct-to-consumer, and pharma space. So we're very heavily regulated in the privacy field. I'm a privacy law specialist and CIPP certified.
Thank you, Natalie. And then Daniel, thank you for joining us. We're just doing intros, so perfect timing. Would you mind introducing yourself, please?
Absolutely. So I'm Daniel Sereduick. I work for Johnson & Johnson. I am EU Data Protection Counsel. So my competency is everything related to European data protection law, as we call it, privacy law in the United States, as well as cybersecurity law more generally.
Great. Thank you, Daniel, and thank you for joining us. So just to start us off, could each of you mind going around the table and just sharing maybe a notable privacy initiative that one of you've worked on? Daniel, do you mind kicking it off for us?
Sure. Well, there's one that is near and dear to my heart that I've been spending a lot of time on lately, which is working through all of the permutations of how do you get to effective anonymization of data. And this is increasingly becoming kind of a critical path for success in anything around processing data, because as you know in security and as we know in privacy, you have a lot less risk when you're processing less data, right? So your risk is always going to be driven by the amount of data that you're processing and the amount of data that you're processing in any particular context. So if you can minimize that data, it can help you, A, have less risk in processing the data, but B, it allows you to do more things, especially if you can effectively anonymize. It can take you outside of data protection law entirely, and then that frees you up to do more interesting things with the data.
Excellent. And may I ask, when you're doing that, Daniel, does that help you also when it comes to test systems and things like that, being able to use more data outside of normal processing areas?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's test systems, R&D work, sort of doing analytics, more broadly. Sometimes when you're processing data on behalf of your customers, and so you may be limited in what you can do with the data. As long as you have the appropriate rights to anonymize the data, you can then pull it out of that process and then potentially use it for various and sundry other purposes. It does require diligence because it's not easy to anonymize, especially to European standards. But if you can do it effectively, it can really drive a lot of value.
And then, Daniel, one more follow-up question on that. Does that include tokenization? Is that kind of some of what you're talking about, or when you say anonymize? Just want to get a little more detail on that, if you don't mind.
So that's a whole rabbit hole. I would say tokenization is a step you can take in that direction. Tokenization, depending on how you do it, may or may not meet the legal definition of anonymization. It's at very least going to be some form of pseudonymization, which brings down the risk of the processing of the data and may get you into safer places. It may be a measure you apply to protect the data, but it may not necessarily get you to anonymization.
Great. Thanks, Daniel. And thanks for letting me drill into that a bit. Natalie, do you mind going?
Yes. So I'm most proud of the fact that with my team, I was able to build a robust, fully compliant privacy program for all of our entities from the ground up, essentially. And as I mentioned earlier, we're in the heavily regulated space. In fact, I think if you name a privacy law, it probably applies to us. So we're like a law school exam hypothetical every day. So we oversee so many types of different types of data, from employee to consumer to job applicant to patient to online visitors to international data transfers. And so obviously this is a very, very important concept for us. And in addition to that, as difficult as it is to do, I was able to create a network of privacy champions across our organization.
Love that.
They don't know that, so don't tell them. But but it's been really effective.
And Natalie, do you find that those privacy champions are adequately going back into the business and kind of meeting the goals you set out for them?
They do, with some hand holding and after some training. And I found, at least in my organization, as busy as everyone else is, it is not a formal role. So I never go to somebody and say, "Hey, would you want to be a privacy champion for your particular department?" It is just much more subtle and a long-term development of a relationship, but it's been incredibly effective and impactful.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Matt?
You know, one of the projects that I worked on that was absolutely fascinating is I had a friend who had a company that was international. They were doing employment and income verification services. They were ultimately acquired by one of the large credit reporting firms. And we had to look at the permissibility of those processing activities across the globe. So we looked at privacy laws in the Philippines, South Korea, China, Japan, Mexico, Brazil, multiple venues throughout Europe. And it was fascinating, ultimately, having reviewed all those various privacy regulations, from kind of the mother of all, the GDPR, to more nuanced privacy regulations in different firms, is just seeing how kind of basic core privacy principles tend to permeate most of those. You know, unfortunately, the US still remains kind of the exception to the rule as it relates to having kind of a national standard. But it was fascinating to be engaged in that project, to speak with counsel in a variety of different countries, understand the nuances around consent management, those things. I really enjoyed the project.
Thanks, Matt. And, you know, that made me think of something that, you know, I know a lot of privacy laws can be based on citizenship or residency. And I was wondering if you encountered anything like people with dual citizenship, for example, if they're looking for a new role. Did you have a way of seeing maybe what was the more restrictive privacy law, depending on their country of residency, if they have more than one? Did that ever come into play?
It did not, but I think the approach to it would be is assume the organization, you know, whatever regulation is most kind of stringent, follow that. I think it's better to kind of follow the most stringent, the most consumer oriented or data subject regulation versus others that might be a little bit more permissible. So
great.
Would be my guidance.
Thank you, Matt. So look, when we think about the theme today, being better together, I was wondering if we could talk a bit about like what departments and roles, not just within technology, but throughout an organization, would you say need to work together to build out a strong and successful privacy program? Who'd like to take that question?
I'll jump in briefly because I want to just champion, no pun intended, what Natalie's doing. When I was an analyst at Gartner, the notion of security champions, having individuals within different departments that would advocate good security practices. The same holds true with respect to privacy. And I think having good, solid working relationships with counsel, certainly with respect to HR, the IT infrastructure and operations teams, it's privacy, like security, does tend to have kind of a whole of entity impact. And so I think you really need to be very collaborative and seek out details with these different departments, understand the nature and extent of the data they collect, where it's sourced from, how it's being used, if it's onward transferred to any third parties. I think those things really are naturally derived from having an open, collaborative set of discussions with key stakeholders throughout the organization.
Thank you, Matt. Daniel and Natalie?
I would agree with that completely. Certainly my experience has been you have to have those open communication channels. Getting intelligence about what's happening in your organization is one of the hardest things to do as a privacy professional. And so having as many touch points will get you a lot more information. I would also say, and this is not sort of like, you know, serving to the interest of the particular summit, but security professionals and privacy professionals work great together. If you're rowing in the right direction, I always like to say that security can solve upwards of 75% of your privacy considerations if you just do the right security design. So, you know, things like role-based privileging, that is minimization in a nutshell, and it can help you sort of limit the risk of privacy exposures, as well as just, you know, making sure you have the right controls in place to ensure the data is being processed for the purpose that it's intended to be processed for, and doesn't kind of sprawl out into your organization. It's easier said than done, but definitely I've been throughout my career, especially since working with Matt and with others, it's always been an opportunity to kind of, you know, get everybody kind of thinking in the same direction, and being able to leverage, because we all fight the same battles, right? Like we're all like resource scarce, and we're trying to drive something that doesn't necessarily directly drive revenue. So we have to kind of, you know, get our seat at the table, and it's better to have two people trying to get the same seat, and collaborating on it, rather than trying to, you know, kind of steal up bandwidth from one another. It doesn't work.
Thank you. Natalie?
So I agree 100% with all that. In fact, my CISO and I, we meet every 2 weeks, and there's not a meeting that we don't learn something new. One of us always learns something new that we wouldn't have known, but not for that meeting. But of course, your question, Nick, is broader. And if we go outside of that, this isn't enough, because my CISO and I could establish the most effective, what we think effective privacy and cybersecurity compliant program, right? But if you don't involve all of the other departments, and I really mean all of them, then your program is not going to be effective. It's going to be a program in a vacuum that's maybe compliant for a minute today. So I've taken great strides, and I think organizations need to do a better job at that sometimes. Of you got to interact and educate. Starting from your C-suite to your HR to your marketing team, your business development team, your compliance team, research and development, customer service. I mean, examples can vary from, have you talked to your customer service team? They're receiving phone calls. Are they recording those calls? Because in half of the states, we're not allowed to record calls without consent from the other side, right? Sometimes your team might be implementing processes on the ground that you as a privacy officer or security officer don't know are ongoing. Your HR team might be, not giving the proper disclaimers to job applicants in California when they're collecting their data, or they might not be, they might be recording, video recording, or employing AI tools in New York. And without talking to you, without them knowing what they need to know, the bare minimum that they need to know about what to look out for, you don't have your privacy champions educated, and you're not getting information conveyed. So the benefits of that cross work across all the teams, it might be intangible because it's very difficult to say, hey, on KPIs, we've just saved you $5 million. Although, I can say that sometimes, because if you've implemented litigation avoidance tools, then you have, right? But those benefits are very, very invaluable because you start issue spotting very quickly.
Thank you. And Natalie, I think it was great. You really touched on between the privacy champions, and then Daniel also talking about, like actually when, outside of like your revenue generating lines of business, I was kind of wondering, how do you, like, when I think about privacy, I often go, okay, I think of back office functions, HR, legal, compliance, security. But of course, really driving this into the lines of business, into the revenue generating areas of the company can be a little more difficult. And so I heard you, Natalie, with privacy champions being subtle. And Matt and Daniel, how would you say like you would drive that culture through a company as well?
Daniel, do you want to go first?
Sure, happy to. I think it's very tricky. I think, everybody is doing, or a lot of times people are doing, unless you have, a really mature privacy champion approach, everybody's doing a lot of this work off the side of their desk. But the places where I've seen this sort of been able to drive this the most effectively is really by tying it to an impact on the business itself. And some of that's especially easier to deliver in the European Union because there's so much of a focus on data protection, just as in the due course of business. This is like top of mind for everybody. It's all of their diligence all the time. And so you have to do things like privacy by design and by default as just part of your standard business practice. It has to be in your design phase. Like if you're building a robot or you're building, a SaaS platform, you have to understand like the security controls that a user is going to expect to see, and the user being the company that's purchasing your equipment or purchasing your solution. They have to understand like what you've done to secure that, what you've thought about in the development phase. And if you aren't able to demonstrate that, you aren't able to show your work on it, it's a much harder sell. And customers certainly are getting increasingly sophisticated about this and will press you very hard if you do not show sort of like the sort of indicators of being competent in this area. And so as I've kind of worked through this with the teams, I always try to explain to them like look, they're gonna know this, right? They're gonna be looking for X, they're gonna be identifying Y as something they expect to see. If you don't show that to them, then they're gonna check out. And if you don't have the right answer, sometimes they're just gonna walk away from the table entirely, and they're gonna say, I'm gonna go to your competitor that knows what they're doing on this topic. So that's the way I try to get the most impact, is because at the end of the day, it's about ROI. It's about driving economic results, and if you can't do that, then you're kind of lost. So that helps sometimes.
Thank you, Matt.
I first and foremost, I love those perspectives. I look at it somewhat philosophically. We live in economies that are predicated on trust. There was an economist at the World Bank, unfortunately, he passed away, named Stephen Knack, and he described the value of quote unquote kind of trust economics. And we live in high trust societies. And so I think there's almost kind of a binary calculus here. You're either doing things that are consistent with what you've kind of conveyed as the stated purpose for collecting that information, or you're doing something else. And if you're doing something else culturally, that starts to really get into bad, kind of shaky ground very, very quickly. Certainly from a regulator perspective, but also with your customers and the value of the brand and the reputation related to it. One of the things that I always recommend, even if the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, is not in scope for your organization, still keep a copy of it and go look at recital 39. And it talks really in this one simple one-page recital about the value of transparency, the value of informing the consumer about the nature and extent of the risk, what types of activities are going to occur when they convey that data to you. So I think, at the heart of it is asking the question, is the way we're managing this data, is the way that we're processing this data, is it engendering trust, or is it destroying trust with the consumer or the data subject, as the case may be?
Excellent. Thank you for that. So when we think about revenue generating, we can also think about large costs as it relates to data privacy. And how would you recommend like a company that maybe is a small to mid-size, and doesn't have the resources of a very large enterprise to throw so many bodies and so much technology at data privacy? Where would you recommend they start? How can they implement and begin to implement an effective data privacy program? Natalie, do you want to kick us off on this one?
Yeah, I can get started. I can start us off on that. So, most of us, of course, even larger companies, resources are always limited, and especially when it comes to privacy, resources are more limited. So I think it's important to start small and then grow from there. The most critical part is that you have to have at least one person in the organization that owns the privacy role, right? Whether it is, ideally through the formal title of some sort, if you can have the budget for that, and if not, even informally, they oversee the privacy function. And they also need to have sufficient time to devote to it, because if you're a privacy officer just on paper, but your day-to-day operations are filled with something else, then you're doing disservice to the organization and you have to speak up. I think from there, if that person is experienced enough, they can train others formally and informally. So for example, at our organization with over 1,200 employees, we offer sessions to different departments across the year where they're pretty short Q&A, and we educate a particular department on what they need to know and issue spot with respect to privacy. And then you get people excited, right? So you tell them about how great it is on their resume if they put, privacy functions on there, how inexpensive and easy it is to obtain privacy certifications. You maybe get them involved in all the different types of events, conferences to attend, and ideally get them involved with the organization that most of us know as IAPP, because International Association of Privacy Professionals has incredible resources. Mm-hmm. And so I think if you don't have the resources to hire a large privacy team, then that's kind of a roundabout way of doing that. I think it's important to remember too, when it comes to the budget, that privacy professionals are always in demand, but you don't necessarily need somebody with a law degree. So that opens up a broader range. And you don't necessarily need somebody who's experienced. So for instance, a good example is my situation. I'm a head of legal for a public company with 4 different companies under my umbrella. So I oversee privacy functions. I don't have time to do them all. So I was able to hire somebody who had an interest in privacy, but had 0 experience. I knew that person is very capable and a quick learner. And within a span of a year, I've made them into privacy experts. So it was a win-win. My budget was limited, but they were coming in to be trained, and they were happy to take on that role. And then from there, whether you're able to do your own data mapping and tabletop exercises, and you keep certain things in-house, you rely on IAPP for those resources and templates. You go to your colleagues and beg for templates, and then, you maybe work with smaller firms instead of big law firms and large providers, smaller firms and smaller vendors that are willing to give you flat fee arrangements, and that predictability is really helpful as a selling point when you ask for the budget.
Thank you. Matt,
Yeah,
Daniel?
I agree with all of that. I think that's especially the part about training up people. I think is it's. I mean, almost everybody who is in this space has been trained up from some other role. I mean, I don't think we've yet reached the highly experienced privacy their entire career person. I think it's everybody kind of segues into that. I mean, I was a regulatory insurance lawyer before I started doing HIPAA, and then I got into doing some security stuff, and it just transitioned for me. I think that's encouraging people who are passionate about it, which there are a lot of people who are passionate about it, is always a good approach. The other thing that I would say is just write stuff down. I mean, at the end of the day, like, keeping track of your knowledge is probably the most important thing that a privacy professional can do, is just know what's going on and put it in some sort of orderly format to the extent that you can to keep track of it. In Europe, you kind of have to do that because you have the obligation to maintain a record of processing activities. So you kind of get back into that. You know, in the European context, there's also data protection impact assessments and other kinds of documentation that tend to have a little bit of a normative flavor to them. So there's kind of a way to do them in some contexts. And having those documents as your resources can be really useful to being able to understand things. And then also, you know, to pull it back to the security theme, your security team may have some of this stuff as well. Like architectural diagrams, I find to be extraordinarily useful because they are a very good way of visualizing where your data is flowing and can help you identify where you need to look for a privacy problem. And so I'm a real big believer in sort of that cross-pollination between data protection, privacy, security, so that all the information is flowing in the right direction so that everybody can make value out of it. So that's what I would encourage, is just write it down.
Thank you.
One thing I would highly recommend is when you think about the various tools that we have at our disposal, these tools don't need to be perfect. So you can start with like a business impact assessment, just fundamentally capturing what are those mission essential functions within the organization, and then very seamlessly pivoting into understanding kind of the nature and extent of the data that particular business process collects, and then thinking through kind of a privacy impact assessment, a legitimate interest assessment, those things, and give yourself the luxury, if you will, to look at those as living documents. You know, they're going to continuously be updated, refined, add more detail over time. And I think the other thing that is absolutely critical are data flow diagrams, and really starting to map out. And these, again, don't need to be complicated. Grab a blank piece of paper, draw 2 lines on it. So you've got 3 columns. Left column, what comes in. Center column, what are the business processes, data elements, applications, data sinks where that information is being used. And then the right column, where would that information be shared? And start thinking about it in that way. Just, it's really kind of developing a good contextual awareness. I go back to what Natalie's doing with respect to privacy champions, and Daniel, the work that you're doing. These things are really valuable. Those insights that you get just having collaborative discussions with other stakeholders informs those living documents over time.
Thank you. So look, as my role as an executive advisor, I often find that talking about successes in my career are not nearly as helpful as talking about the mistakes I've made. Maybe the pitfalls that people can watch out for, the roadblocks I've encountered, and really just the bad decisions I've made in my career. I guess I'd like to turn it over to you and see, like, what mistakes would you suggest that people possibly could avoid with a little forethought?
I'll weigh in just briefly. Don't over collect data. You know, there is a lot of digital detritus out there, and I think, you know, when you look at it, we tend to be overly aggressive on how much information we collect on people, and we make assumptions about how that data is going to be used. I see it repeatedly. All the email that I get every day. I've never even known this company, and yet they're emailing me. All the different stuff that we see out there. Is very frustrating. And, you know, if I throw on a CISO hat, it becomes in many cases almost an unfunded liability. If I've got 1 million records, but only 100,000 of those are actual customers, I've got, you know, past records, past clients. If there's a data breach, I'm doing credit monitoring, reporting, dealing with regulators on a much larger set of individuals than if I kind of made it to those individuals that are current customers where there's a valid, legitimate reason to have their data. So I would say, you know, focus in on data minimization.
Data minimization is so critical, so critical. And I'm looking at our chat, and somebody just made a comment that I just really want to piggyback on and would steal their thunder, because they say, privacy and security needs to start small and continuously build on. And that's really the biggest mistake that I have made. And my biggest regret is when I rolled up my sleeves, I said, within 3 months, my organization is going to have this fully compliant privacy compliance program, HIPAA compliant program, a GDPR compliant program, and you can't. You're going to overwhelm yourself and you're going to overwhelm your team. So it is important to prioritize, and you start small with what your priority is today. And you tell yourself that priority, you're going to tackle that first until that's done, and you're going to turn to the next thing next. And yes, there are deadlines and there are legal requirements, but obviously just priority is key, because you're just one small team or one person with limited resources. You can't get it all done.
Yeah, and those two are both basically my two answers. I will say, to kind of to lay on top of that, because I agree entirely. I fought so many battles on record retention and disposal that it's exhausting to even just think about it. And I'm going to have to keep fighting them, because it's everybody has this problem. And one thing I will add on to that is try to engineer your processes and your systems so that you can actually dispose of the data, because one of the trickiest things I've run into is not just actually having the data, but it's if you just delete the data, you're actually going to break something. It could be relational databases, it could be some sort of like data architecture you have. Make sure that you've built it so you can do erasure requests when you need to, do periodic disposal in accordance with your retention guidelines, and then you're going to be in good shape. It might be a pain to get there, but it's definitely well worth the pain that you would experience otherwise in the future. And I would just say, just more generally, just try to take the risks that are worth taking, and don't make big mistakes, I guess is what I would say. And that's like easier said than done. That's sort of like, well, I don't know it's a big mistake until I make it. But I think it's always useful to kind of imagine what the worst case scenario is. And if you're going to have a worst case scenario that's like a catastrophic event for the company, then you probably don't want to do that. You may have to insert, especially because I've been in the startup sector before too. It's like there's certain times where you say, this is actually worth betting the company because it is that important. Probably not a regulatory types of concepts, but you have to think it through. But I would just say, try to pick the battles that are worth winning, pick the battles that are going to get you the best ROI, and don't do things that are going to kill a company. And then you'll be in good shape, and the mistakes you make will be manageable, and then you just learn and iterate.
Thank you. Well, look, sorry, go ahead, Matt, please.
I was going to say, just to weigh in a little bit on what Daniel said, when we think about like retention, it highlights one of the dynamics of our space is that you have kind of overlapping accountabilities. My apologies to a racing matrix where there should only be one accountable party. But the problem is that you have infrastructure and operations, you've got counsel, you've got the business, and they may have very distinct ideas about how certain activities are processed, how long data should be retained. And so I think one of the most foundational things to start doing with your privacy program is really mapping out those functions. Who ultimately makes the decision, who should be consulted, who should be informed, things of that nature. It's a very difficult space, I think, in that sense, because it doesn't, unless you have the luxury of having a formal chief privacy officer in the organization, a lot of times it's that department's role, so a bit of a challenge.
Thank you. Well, look, I know we're running out of time here. I do want to make sure I thank all three of you again for joining us today. And I did want to give you a chance if there were any closing remarks or anything you wanted to bring up that we haven't touched on yet. Daniel, would you like to start us off with this?
Sure. Just record retention and disposal. It seriously is like the number one thing on every list I've ever made. It's always the battle that is the battle worth fighting. It's especially, I'll just mention from a European perspective, it's especially important because the United States approach tends to be retain more. But that does not work in Europe because there are very strong expectations of minimization. Of course, all laws sort of have a minimization kind of concept in them, but you can get into some really big trouble if you over retain data in Europe, and they are starting to enforce on that. So I do encourage to keep your risk low because if you don't have the data, you can't make a mistake in processing it.
Yeah, and Daniel, having worked for many banks in my time, I know it used to be standard for us to keep, 7 years had always been the just keep it for 7 years. And then now that you enter into the right to be forgotten, it's okay. Well, how do you get that data for that individual out of a backup that's 6.5 years old? So I echo.
You try not to keep the backup. And in Europe, you have to do that assessment, right? You have to do a balancing test about the obligation to retain versus the rights of the data subject to be, have their data protected. So it's a tricky one.
Thank you, Daniel. Natalie?
I agree with Daniel. I think that's critical. I'll also follow up and say, your privacy champions are very important. They're not going to be very willing. So just get people engaged and involved subtly. Send them articles, compliment them on their interest, offer short training sessions, get people to cross-collaborate together.
And Matt?
I would say think like you are the consumer or the customer of that company. Are your processing activities engendering trust, or are they destroying trust with that audience? And try to always do the right thing. I think if you go in it kind of philosophically, we want to do things that engender trust, you're in good stead.
Well, again, Matt, Natalie, Daniel, thank you for joining the panel today, and thanks to everyone for listening in. I hope you have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, take care.
Thank you.
Cheers.